My name is Serge Jonnaert. I'm a Senior Vice President, Technology M&A at Corum Group. Thought this would be a good opportunity for you to talk a little bit about the life cycle of your company. Anyway, so here's a little bit of my background. I've been a tech entrepreneur and trusted advisor for well over 35 years. Right now, I do nothing but facilitating the sale of technology and health tech companies. Have over the last, let's say, 3 years, done 14 transactions. But I also sit on several boards in healthcare. The president and board member of the IVD Industry Connectivity Consortium, which focuses on interoperability. And I'm also an active member of the SHIELD workgroup, which includes representation not only of industry, but the FDA, CDC, ONC, and several other groups. A little bit, what is this all about? Well, I'm sure that some of you, as you are embarking at commercializing maybe some of your inventions or some of your technologies, and are looking at building companies, in the back of your mind, for most of you, as an entrepreneur, you're thinking about a good exit. If you don't, you really should, and we'll talk a little bit about getting ready for an exit very early on, because ultimately there'll come a point in your life where you may want to hand off your baby to another company, and hopefully get a significant amount of money for that so that you can enjoy some of the better things in life as well. Unfortunately, as so many embark on this journey and get closer to potentially having an exit, only 25% of companies will actually enjoy an optimal exit. And we'll talk a little bit about what that truly means. About a quarter will have what we call a suboptimal exit, that may be just not getting the right valuation or just not landing with the right partner. But believe it or not, about half of the companies that start today or started a couple of years ago will fail to exit at all and either end up shutting down, winding down their operation. So we'll talk a little bit about selling, when and why, technology driving deals and value, who is buying companies, why are they interested in acquiring, planning with the exit in mind, even if you're not generating any revenue yet, or you're still in a very early stages of concepting or productizing your product. It's really good to start thinking about this part of the journey as well. And then the whole process of getting your company sold, building what we call a buyer bridge. How do you avoid deal disasters? Can tell you many war stories on that. And then when we talk about core to our process is really to get a bit of a bidding war going so that you can capture the maximum value for your company. Quick slide about us as a company. Corum Group is the leading tech M&A firm. Over the years, we've done well over 500 transactions, more than $20 billion in transaction value. We've been around for 36 plus years. We're also recognized by Axial as one of the companies in the top 50 worldwide. We're a little bit different in that we are former tech execs and CEOs ourselves that have started, grown, and sold our companies. Why is it important? Well, for one, we understand your world. We understand what it takes also to build and operate a company. So it also makes us good coaches throughout the whole process. But we've truly developed a disciplined global best practice approach. Again, we were not just single deal makers, but we have a whole team now of about well over 100 people of writers, valuation experts, and researchers that facilitate some of the transactions that we're doing. We also do a lot of research. If you're interested, I can send you a link to our health tech report. We, on a quarterly basis, will give you an update on what we're seeing in the market in terms of valuations, in terms of most recent transactions. Definitely worthwhile taking a look at it. And we do a tremendous amount of events, both educational as well as market informative. Our premier event is called Selling Up, Selling Out. We do right now well over 500 events a year and have well over 10,000 attendees from all over the world. Here's a quick picture of some of our tombstones. If you are interested in seeing some of the transactions that we have done over the years, just go to www.corumgroup.com. So, selling, when and why? Well, why would you sell your company? Well, there could be a number of reasons. First and foremost, you may just want to take some money off the table, right? If you've built your companies for a couple of years, most companies actually exit at when they get to kind of that 16 or 18 year mark. So there's nothing wrong when you go into the next phase of your life that you want to just put some money aside for yourself to go off and do something else, or even to safeguard some money for your children and or grandchildren. You may also be looking to find a partner to help you fund the growth of the company, especially in under market conditions that may be competitive. You may just need a partner with a much bigger footprint, and that also has the financial resources where instead of you being the main salesperson or maybe having one or two salespeople, now all of a sudden you may have access, especially when you're thinking about life sciences and diagnostics companies. You think about companies like Roche, Bio-Rad, bioMérieux, Siemens Healthineers. Most of these companies have well over 700, 800,000 salespeople on the ground worldwide, and they can literally catapult you from obscurity to becoming a household name almost in your industry overnight. Succession may be a driver. Unfortunately, we all get to that point in our lives where we may face mortality or get sick or become incapacitated. We've had over the years several scenarios. I had one company a couple of years ago that I sold where the CEO had rapidly advancing MS, and so we needed to find a home for the company. But it could just be burnout, right? It could be for yourself as well as for your partners. You may have just done this for 10 years, 14 years. You may have done great, but you just want to take it easier, go fishing, go travel the world, maybe do something else in life. Or you may also be a serial entrepreneur looking at starting your next venture and eager to close this one out. Conflict is also a driver. We see this all too often, scenarios where husband and wife started a company, there's a divorce, and now the company needs to get sold because the assets need to be divided. But you can also have partners that started their company right out of high school or coming out of college, were the best of friends, but quickly realize that they are not the best of business partners. So there'll always be different motivations to sell a company. The question, of course, is going to be when to sell. Well, there's going to be different reasons for different companies. One, of course, is high market demand and valuations. We've now enjoyed, a 13-year bull run in the market. Market is a little bit softer right now, but you'll see from some of the stats that I'll share you that the activity level is still very high, especially on the M&A side, and so are valuations. You may be getting inbound inquiries, companies that you are talking to about maybe licensing your technology may just want to take it a step further and say, you know what, why don't we just buy the company altogether? You may provide a disruptive technology. I would suggest downloading Corum's top 10 disruptive technologies. It is a report that we generate every year, and where we highlight some of the key areas where we see the most M&A activity and also the highest valuations. There can also be market changes, right? All of a sudden, you have a couple of competitors that are all being gobbled up, and you realize that you're the last one standing. That can be unnerving, especially when now all of a sudden your number one competitor becomes a $2-3 billion corporation, and you're still in an early growth stage. But there can be a paradigm shift. Think, for example, what Uber did to the taxi industry. Think back a little bit further in time about what happened to Kodak and Polaroid when digital photography came out. I mean, you can literally be factored out of the market overnight with a company that comes out with a new disruptive technology. But you may also have reached a threshold that makes you attractive. Most of the companies that we deal with, or most of the buyers that we deal with, will have very hard set minimum thresholds. In most cases, it's $5 million in revenue, $1 million to $1.5 million in EBITDA. So, and then of course, for yourself, you may just be ready to go off and do something else. Another key consideration, of course, is market cyclicality. If you look at some of the big peaks in health tech, and life sciences we've seen over the last, I would say, 20, 30 years, well, we saw a peak in just before 2000. That was definitely more a technology-driven crash where they were still underwriting big, almost insane funding rounds for companies up to about May. And then when the market started softening in July and completely went into a downward spiral in August, you can see from this chart here what ultimately happened to valuations. Same thing happened again in 2008. That had much broader market implications. So pretty much the whole market, including healthcare, including life sciences, was severely impacted, and that's kind of where we saw the next big drop. And what's important to know about the slide here is that you definitely don't want to be selling your company when you're on a downward spiral in the market. You want to get ahead of all that. If you look at where we're at right now, surprisingly, the market has been very resilient, but we are definitely concerned a little bit about what lies ahead, especially post next year's election. This is kind of just over the last, I would say, 2 years, what we've seen in terms of market volatility, which is showing here the S&P as well as Dow Jones as kind of the two major metrics. But what's important to see here that once again, we had a little bit of a dip in the last couple of weeks, kind of usually what happens at the end of the summer, September, tends to be a little bit soft, but we're expecting the market just go up again. But overall, you look at what the market has done, and for most of the last 2 years, we've remained in positive growth territory. So, same thing for the subsectors that we track. Health tech and life sciences falls under our vertical market segment. That's the green line, and you look at it here. Just in Q1, we saw a little bit of a dip, but since Q2 now, we've seen again very high valuations, both on an enterprise value over sales, as well as enterprise value over EBITDA. Of course, what are some of the concerns that you always have to keep in mind? Because if you do have a major market contraction, it can take 6 years longer for the market to recover. So you do want to stay ahead of all that. And so geopolitical disruption, think about the lingering Russia-Ukraine conflict, the continuous threats now by China to invade Taiwan. Any of those events individually can always send a market into a tailspin. And there's, of course, other things that are still going on: hyperinflation, currency concerns in some countries, especially in the Middle East and what have you. Inflation, we're not out of the woods there. I mean, it's we still have the central banks all over the world that are making some course corrections as necessary. I think we've been good now for the last quarter and a half, but we'll see how that plays out as we head into an election year next year. Rising interest rates is kind of directly linked to inflation. And then, of course, if you do have a stock market adjustment, then this is something that usually has global ramifications. And that's when a couple of months later, where we do see the M&A cycle end. Here are the 2023 top 10 disruptive technology trends that I spoke about earlier. This is a picture that changes year over year. Some of them, including health tech, continue to stay strong. It all depends a little bit. Needless to say, companies that benefited tremendously from COVID, we're still seeing some activity there. But in terms of kind of truly innovative ways, and on the diagnostic side, on the life sciences side, we definitely see very strong interest in that. So why should you care? Well, these tech trends create change, right? And that drives a strategic imperative, especially for the big strategics that would say, hey, here's what we're looking for. And if you're a company that fits into one of these strategic trends, you will absolutely be well positioned to get sold. Why is it also important? Sometimes you may say, you know what, we're way too early to get sold. We haven't reached that first $1 million revenue milestone. We just got our patents approved. But you'd be surprised. I mean, from our experience, we call this the pioneer stage. There's usually going to be a little bit of buzz around what you're doing, with the novelty of it. And you may actually end up in a scenario where some of the big strategics may come to you and say, you know what, we know you're not quite there yet. You may not have your CE mark or your FDA 510K clearance, or you're still doing a de novo filing, but we love what you're doing. And we're interested in buying you. And that hesitation can be very costly, because once you miss that first kind of initial excitement window, as we would call it, that pioneer stage, now you get into a mode where you need to prove yourself operationally. So you need to be able to get your team together, build a company, build your sales and marketing team, get some commercial traction. And that's kind of where you flatline a little bit until all of a sudden, usually 3-4 years later, you finally start to get some market traction. And surprisingly, that is also what at that point is going to drive your valuation. So never dismiss the possibility of getting your company sold earlier, especially in that pioneer stage. So For some of you, you may already be at, you may have already done kind of the friends and family round, a seed round, and now you're looking at a Series A through E. Unfortunately, and this is definitely something that is very different in the market today, especially after what happened to Silicon Valley Bank. We pretty much saw a lot of VC funding raises, IPOs, as well as SPACs coming to a complete halt. We're expecting that for the second half, VC funding is going to pick up a little bit again, but there's definitely been a significant drop in the valuations, and we're starting to see a little bit more safeguards that VCs put into their funding agreements. So definitely something that if you're at that point where we should have a quick call about. But of course, the other considerations that come into play is if you're doing a raise, you're going to give up equity without necessarily getting immediate liquidity. So sometimes you can do it when you're doing a raise, say, for example, $7 million on a $20 million post, and where there's an agreement where you can take some money off the table, but it will definitely be at a somewhat of a discount. And that's something to think about, because if you go the M&A route, of course, you're selling your shares into company, or you're selling assets into the company and then you get paid out as a dividend. But at least there's an opportunity for you to take some money off the table one time, maybe roll some equity and then get another second bite from the apple as well. The other things to think about is that you may just lose control over your company. I mean, we see this all too often where companies have a couple of funding rounds. The board takes full control, blocks and tackles everything that you want to do. And in the end, it is not unheard of where you have a CEO that gets to a point where they maybe only have like 3, 4, 5, 7% of a company left, and literally walk away because they say, you know what, I'm tired of all this nonsense. I don't want to have to deal with this anymore, and walk away from their companies. You may have missed that optimal M&A window that we talked about earlier. And unfortunately, you may end up with nothing as well. We see that as well, where all of a sudden, I mean, you have VCs that have deal structures where sometimes you sign at the dotted line and you don't really realize that they have preferred liquidation rights. I had a scenario like that a couple of years ago, a company that I sold where the VC through 3 entities basically had preferred liquidation rights up to $25 million. We sold the company for $21 million. And so the founders that had worked on this company for 6 years ended up getting nothing out of the deal. So I had to go to the buyer, negotiate a deal with an option and a stock plan and a retention plan. Otherwise, those guys would have walked as well. So definitely something to be very careful about. So let's talk a little bit about who is buying out there. Well, first of all, you have the strategics. There's about $1 trillion in cash that's sitting on the sidelines, thinking about some of the big life sciences companies. So the question then is, well, why did they buy? Well, they may already have products that could be complementary or services, or they may have a distribution network. I said this earlier, they may have 700 or 1,000 people on the ground that all of a sudden are eager to sell your product. They may already be in your food chain. You may already licensing your technology to them, or they may be a supplier to you. But one of the things that is absolutely going to be a key factor, especially with these big multi-billion-dollar corporations, is that they absolutely, most of them will struggle with innovation and entrepreneurship. I experienced that myself. I worked for Bio-Rad for 10 years, and so all too often where you would kind of get the sense of, oh, well, what happens if we develop this in-house? And then ends up being a scenario where it takes them 3, 4, 5 years, and it doesn't get anywhere near to what the products or the company that they could have potentially acquired. And there's a big opportunity loss there, right? So most companies become very conscious of that and say, hey, if we just buy this company, scale it up, what would that represent in terms of market opportunity for us? They could also be a competitor, not necessarily a bad thing. We deal with that all the time. You just need to, of course, approach that with a little bit of extra caution. And then, of course, there's the financial buyers, mostly private equity. They're just going to, I mean, you see some of the big names that we deal with, Vista, Riverside, Marlin Equity. I mean, I'm literally engaged right now on a deal with 4 of the names that you see here. What's important, though, is that for every single one of these big names, there's about 300 smaller private equity offices and family offices that are, of course, also competing for deals. So they're going to look for either a platform, or they're going to look for bolt-ons or tuck-ins, companies that they can just integrate with a company that they already have in their portfolio. Most of the times, it used to be like there would be raiders, right? They would buy a company, lean it out, scale it up, and then basically sell it again 3, 4, 5 years later. Most of the times now, they have a hold strategy, either with the intent at some point to take a portfolio of companies public. But they will, of course, will be looking for at your opportunity with a little bit more financial scrutiny as well. So they're going to look at revenue concentration. What is your growth profile? What has your past performance been? Usually 3 years. And what are your projections going forward? So they'll come back with a lot of spreadsheet work for you, but at the same time, the due diligence is going to be a little bit tougher. But at the same time, it could be a great opportunity for you. And it could also be a scenario where they recapitalize your company for 80, 90%, meaning you hold on to the next 10 or 20%. And you get a second bite from the apple that in some cases, we had this 3 years ago, a company sold, or at least got recapitalized for 80%. And then 3 years later, the seller, so the company got sold again by the private equity company, and the seller got a second payout of almost equal the amount that he got the first go around. A couple of things that we track, of course, is who are the private equity companies that have the most transactions year over year. This picture changes somewhat. Vista has usually been kind of in that top 5. So has Thoma Bravo. But here are just some of the numbers. HG is now the biggest one, followed by TA Associates. But what's important here is that, again, going back to that argument of, oh, maybe I don't meet the criteria, maybe my company's a little bit too small. Well, what you see here is in this goldish color is those are actually the platform acquisitions that they've done. All the rest in dark blue were bolt-ons, and sometimes they've lowered the criteria. They basically say, you know what, we're just looking for the strategic value. We don't care that the company is only $2 million in revenue or even less, as long as it adds strategic value to a company that we already have in our portfolio. So what are they going to be looking for? Well, first and foremost, strategic fit, revenue growth, and proven scale. sorry, that's always going to be a driver, right? They want to see, well, what have you done? Where are you at? Where are you going? What is the market potential for your company? What is that total addressable market, right? If you're already at like in a very narrow market segment and you already have like 80-90% of the market, then nobody's going to be interested in you, right? So it really has to be something where they kind of back of the envelope can say, we have 500 salespeople, we have synergistic products. If each of our salespeople can do $100,000 in business, what does that ultimately represent to you? And that's kind of how you work the valuation down from there. Ideally, there's predictable recurring revenues. Transactional is fine, but and this is also where on the software side, we see a lot of interest in AI, subscription, SaaS models. It all depends a little bit what it is that you're doing. They will want to see a high customer retention, depending, of course, on the maturity of the company, and a low or negative churn. Well, they want to see some gross margins. They will want to look at maybe improving that a little bit, but at the end, they want to say, hey, how much money is there in this business, right? And then low customer concentration. And the last one, of course, relevant here on life science and diagnostics side. What is the regulatory pathway for your product, and where are you at, right? Are you still kind of in exploratory discussions with the FDA on a de novo filing, or is there already a couple of companies that are doing what you're doing, and you can basically use that predicate and fairly quickly do your filing and get approval, or have already gotten approval, both here as well as abroad. So what are they going to look for? Well, they're of course going to look at your financials, make sense, right? They'll look at your revenue, your earnings, what is your growth profile, what does your balance sheet look like? But one of the things that we, of course, do and are very good at is kind of moving the discussion from just that financial discussion to the tangibles and the intangibles, right? What is your market position? Do you offer any barriers to entry? Do you have any unique IP? But also, who are you? Who is your company? Who is your leadership? We sometimes see companies with like 5 founders, all PhDs, all have very distinct skill sets. So those are all things that we try to highlight more, bring out more, because those are those intangible value drivers. I mean, you can't say, okay, well, one PhD is worth $4 million, 2 PhDs. Oh, now the value bumps up to $6 million. But a company can definitely kind of make a fair assessment as to what that would be worth to them. So start with the exit in mind. Doesn't matter whether you're thinking about growing your company and selling it 2 years from now, or selling it 5 years from now, or 20 years from now. You really need to always start with that exit in mind. And what does that mean? I mean, ultimately, from an optimal M&A outcome, you want to capture, of course, the maximum value for your baby. You may have worked 6, 10, 15 years on your company. You're not selling a car, you're not selling a house. So you want to make sure that when you handle a transaction, that's taken care of by our experts at doing this. But you also want to have the best transaction structure. What does that mean? I mean, we're not going to go in depth into this, but if you are contemplating or would want to learn a little bit more about that, we definitely recommend attending one of our Selling Up, Selling Out events. you can see the calendar of events. Actually, I'm hosting an LA event, both online and live, in a couple of weeks. So it's on the calendar at corumgroup.com. But in an ideal scenario, so you have maximum value, perfect structure, you minimize your personal liability. You want to make sure that a deal is structured, that you pay a minimum amount of taxes, maybe throw in an employment agreement or consulting agreement. Those things can be very lucrative as well over a couple of years. I mean, sometimes we're talking about tagging on another couple of $1 million in the deal structure just by negotiating employment agreements very early on. And then, of course, making sure that there's good cultural fit, that ultimately everybody ends up being happy with the deal, and that you have a proper integration post-close. So what are some of the things that you can already do now? Believe it or not, get ready for due diligence. All too often, we're dealing with companies that have been around for 15, 20 years, and they've got like some contracts and all kinds of documents that are still in the paper format, stored somewhere in the warehouse. And that can complicate things, right? So make sure you do kind of good housekeeping, set up folders on your computer or on your server or on the cloud, even better, for every year, where you keep diligent track of all your contracts, all your purchases, everything the same way as you would be required to do so for a potential IRS audit, but add to that legal, employee records, et cetera, et cetera. The more and the better structured you do that, the easier it will be for you to move into a due diligence process. Of course, you want to keep GAAP compliant accounting records with the proper revenue recognition. If you want to learn a little bit more about that, again, selling up, selling out, and we can also provide you kind of a top 60 checklist of all the documents that you can reasonably be expected to be asked by a prospective buyer as part of a due diligence process. One other thing you also have to be very careful of is to make sure that any contracts that you put in place with suppliers, with distribution partners, doesn't have any hidden change of control clauses, because those are things that can absolutely hamper you when you are ready to sell the company. And just making sure that you kind of work towards making your company, that you know what the value is of your company, that you can articulate that at any point in time, and also can articulate what both the tangibles and intangibles are. Again, attend one of our selling up, selling out boot camps. I can give you a discount code where you can attend this for free. And don't make concessions to investors that may ultimately complicate or kill a future deal, right? So you want to avoid complex cap tables, corporate structures, and some preferred liquidation rights. You will always have to make some concessions, but definitely make sure that you're fully aware of what you're getting yourself into. Make your enterprise value a conscious goal. And again, I mean, focus on financial growth and continuous improvement. So, and when you are at that point where you say, you know what, I'm ready to sell my company, give it some thought what life will look like after the sale. I mean, it can be a life-changing event for you. So here are some of the M&A truths. I want to make sure that we stay on time here. A lot of companies are going to miss their once and most opportune market window. Definitely something to think about. Valuations, they're just data points. From our perspective, it's ultimately competitive tension that will drive your value. And as a result of that, you need to have more than one buyer at the table to kind of leverage one against the other. You want to use a professional company that runs a global process. It's the only way to get absolutely an optimal outcome. At the end of the day, it is all about storytelling and negotiating. That's what we do all the time, kind of contextualizing what you as an opportunity represent in the context of the buyer. And don't play games. Once a buyer passes on your company, it's going to take twice the effort to regain their interest. So you want to be very careful about that. M&A is a journey. We can talk about that or we talk about that at length in our Selling Up, Selling Out seminar. So how do you capture that maximum value? Well, of course, valuation is always going to be dictated by the market. Company A is going to look at you and say, you know what, we can turn that into a $200 million business. And their valuation kind of framing is going to be driven by that. Another company may say, oh my gosh, we can get this in 1 year to $1 billion. Well, guess what? That's going to drive their valuation, right? So ultimately, you want to create that competitive tension. You want to create an auction environment. And we've seen over the years that the average uplift is actually 48%. So think about it this way. Company A makes an opening offer for you. Well, by the time we're all ready to sell or at least to close a deal, we will on average have seen an uplift of about 48%. Frankly, in the last couple of years, even through COVID, we saw uplifts of about 75 to 90%. Why is that important? Well, there's always going to be somebody who courts you and you say, you know what? Yeah, hey, great. We'll take the offer, only to find out later that you could have got maybe another $5 million, another $10 million. And it's not a good feeling. So you want to make sure that right from the get-go, you capture that uplift, you capture the most possible value. Financials, but also most strategics are, of course, going to go through the motions of looking at your valuation from a discount cash flow, replacement cost analysis. I mean, it's all part of the financial package because they'll usually will have to pitch that internally as well. So again, that upsell comes from the intangibles. The value enhances what makes you unique. Where is that value that you would want, or at least would basically force somebody to buy your company? And so here's a little bit kind of what that ultimately represents in terms of both external and internal drivers or those valuation factors. Right? Of course, internally, it'll be driven by the quality of your revenue, your growth, your margins, what is your total accessible market, your intellectual property. But we'll add to that that externally, of course, is going to be driven by where the market is at. We saw in 2000 and 2008, some companies lose 80% of their value overnight. So you definitely don't want to be in one of those down cycles. And of course, the quality of the M&A process. It's easy to get a deal done. It takes a little bit more work and a little bit more skill to get an optimal deal done. So just a couple of scenarios where a couple of one of those auction progressions. I'm sure that you get the gist of this. The first one was a health tech company. They got a preemptive offer of $16 million, ran a process, got them to $20 million, and then got a third offer of $25 million, and then the final offer ended up being $40 million. What is playing very big here is kind of the FOMO, right? Because, sorry. My apologies. There's nothing worse for a company to kind of, or at least a corp dev guy, to go back to his CEO and his board and say, you know what, we lost to company A or B over $1 million, right? You kind of go back with your tail between your legs. And that's kind of what this is all about, the psychology of kind of bidding and the fear of missing out. So what's important, though, is that you know where all your prospective buyers may be worldwide, right? Because this is not only US-centric. A lot of the companies that may be interested in acquiring you may be in Europe, they may be in Asia, they may be in Australia even. We do a lot of transactions there as well. And then, of course, from a process point of view, you need to be able to kind of time box this in the 60 to 90 days, where can you qualify them all within days, not months? Can you articulate your value? And then, I mean, those are all the things that you have to look at. How many NDAs can you process over a weekend? Deal with disclosure requests. All of a sudden, it starts to become a little bit overwhelming. And that's a part that you have to be very careful of if you're thinking about doing this yourself, because now you're in a full process, you're talking to a couple of companies. It is a distraction. Your business suffers. Well, if your business suffers, that is, of course, also not going to have a good impact on your valuation. I'm going to skip this here. But here it's important, though, a couple of the numbers. 11% is the number, only the number of inbounds that actually end up in the transaction. So think about it this way. 90% of these inbounds end up not going anywhere. If you create an auction process, 48% is that average improvement from first offer to closing. 75% is how often a company is going to be willing to outbid an initial bidder. 80% is the failure in self-managed tech M&A. And 100% is going to be the scenario where you're only dealing with one bidder. Well, they're going to control the whole scenario, and you will always end up with a suboptimal offer. So quick, let's see here. We have a couple of minutes to go here. We'll talk a little bit about the process. Again, this is our best practice approach. Highly recommend attending Selling Up, Selling Out. We cover every single phase of this in more detail. But this is, again, what it translates into creating that funnel to get to an optimal outcome. In our practice, we will usually target somewhere between 100 and 200 companies. That translates into 700 to 1,000 communications, email, phone calls, in-person meetings, LinkedIn, you name it. If you do it right, you get about 10 to 30 interested parties, about 5 to 15 NDAs. And in the end, we end up with about 1 to 5 offers. What do you need to do to avoid a deal disaster? Well, sorry about that. First of all, confidentiality, both internally and externally. Think about it this way. A process will easily take 6 to 12 months. You don't want to have your employees to catch wind of what you're doing, and then they're just sitting there twiddling their thumbs until the company is sold. Result of that can be absolutely disastrous. You always want to be careful of who you're dealing with and how much information you share, as you would expect. Yeah, I mean, they're going to court you. They're going to say, oh, I love what you're doing. Can we see a little bit more, this and that? And you quickly get courted maybe into sharing a little bit more than what you should. Loss of staff, of course, is a value destroyer. You wearing out, your team wearing out. Again, I mean, even if you have a banker facilitate your transaction, it is still going to take a good amount of your time. So you want to make sure that you kind of balance, making sure that your company stays on track and that you dedicate enough time, enough quality time to running the process. Worst case, of course, is business drop off, lack of focus. You're like 3 months into your process. We're coming on the year end here. And unfortunately, you had said that you were going to do $6 million in revenue and you're only going to come in at $5 million. Well, guess what? The buyer is going to want to retrade the deal, and it's never a good thing. I think you can imagine what happens then. So, last point, especially in times like this, going to market too late. What are some of the deal killers? Again, no need to beat this one to death. Dealing with only one buyer, having misalignment between you, the shareholders, your key employees, and management, right? I always say before you embark on this process, you want to make sure that everybody's on the bus, that you're ready to go. And that's that's of course key in making sure that you're going to have a successful transaction. Contacting a buyer at the wrong level. This is absolutely the one time where you have an opportunity to talk to the C-level, the CEO, the CFO, or their corp dev representation. Not researching the potential buyer properly, and also not understanding the buyer's process. Sometimes you're dealing with public companies that will take their time in evaluating you as an opportunity. 6 is not being able to kind of portray your value or telling your story. I mean, it's key. It's absolutely key. You wanna get buyers excited about what you're doing. Right? And then ego, greed, and arrogance. Know what you're worth, but don't be greedy. I mean, if the buyer thinks that your value is here and you say, no, we think we're going to do $1.2 billion in the next 5 years. Everybody has a little bit of the unicorn expectations, but the reality is that very few companies make it to that level. So you do need to understand truly what your value is and be willing to give that fair consideration. So again, I said that. If you are dealing with product managers or division managers in the company right now, great. But when you're talking M&A, that is when you want to talk to the CEO or their corp dev person. I will close it with this slide. Of course, us as bankers, we are going to be looking at getting your company sold. So do an exit with a sale in mind. But there's other ancillary benefits of running a professional process as well. One, of course, is the whole model, the research that you get access to, some of the market feedback. I mean, you get raw feedback from CEOs that will tell you what they like, what they don't like. That may be the impetus for you to kind of say, you know what, maybe we need to take a pause and fine tune our model a little bit before we go back to market. But number 4 is also a critical one, because not everybody's going to be interested in buying your company, but they may be willing to license your technology or just set up a commercial agreement. And all of these things in aggregate will justify the time and expense of doing a global partner search. I'll just show you this use case that we usually talk about. We had one company a couple of years ago. They had $3 million in revenue, took them to market. We got 2 offers in the $5 to $8 million range. Both deals fell apart. One had an SEC investigation, so they halted all their M&A activity. And the second company, the product champion, left. Both these companies went on hiatus. They got some good feedback, so they tightened up their product market fit, their pricing. And then 18 months later, they re-entered the market, and we ended up getting them recapitalized for 90% for a value of $40 million. So think about it. The owners of the company got $36 million first round. 2 years later, company sold again for $100 million. So they got $36 million first round and then another $10 million for the final 10% 2 years later. So it was a total of $46 million. So when you think about that, they might have easily taken a $5 to $8 million offer when they went to market first. Because they waited, they were able to get ultimately $46 million. This happens fairly frequently. So in summary, again, still a great M&A market. There's a lot of active buyers out there, both strategics and financials. There's a lot of dry powder looking to buy companies, especially if you have something interesting. Both transactions, large and small. And time is not always your friend, right? Because you may say, you know what, I only see ourselves getting sold 5, 6, 10 years from now, only to find out that a competitor eclipsed you over that time and you end up with really nothing. So always pay attention to the M&A market. If you want to attend our webcasts or our merge briefings or our selling up, selling out events, they'll load it with information. So just go to corumgroup.com events, or you can also listen to some of our events at the WFS, or World Financial Symposiums, of which we are the main sponsor, more specific to market subsegments.